project. This is going to be it. It is another McCalls. There you go. Takes a while for it to focus. What I'm going to be doing is a dress. Well, it's actually going to be this dress, but slightly longer. I think this dress is cut so that it is a more of a short skirt. I want mine halfway between these two lengths, more like a T length. The fun thing about this dress, it does button down the front, so we'll have a whole lot of buttoning things going on. And the fabric I'm going to use is this stuff here. Now, I pre-washed last night. I did it as harsh as I could. I used hot water in the wash and I ran it through the dryer until everything was completely dry, because I wanted to make sure if something was going to shrink, it would shrink. So this stuff is a border print, which I plan on taking advantage of for the bottom of the skirt and maybe a sleeves. But if you can see, it stretches. So this is a selvage edge here, and it stretches this way. And because I'm going to be using this as the up and down, I want to make sure that it has time to stretch out all it's going to before I start cutting into it. So I just have it hanging up on a hanger, and I'm going to leave it there for a while. So I am going to be lining this dress, and I'm lining this dress for structure. Yeah, it's a little see-through, so my lining's going to help that. But I'm lining it also because there is that stretch, and it is a princess seam dress, and it does have all those buttons, and I want to make sure it's going to stay pulled together enough. So what I'm going to use as lining is this broadcloth. And again, I washed this in super hot water, dried the schnuts out of it last night, and it looks like this is 100% cotton. I forgot what it was, but it looks like it's 100% cotton based on how it's wrinkling up here and how it feels. So I need to iron this, but I am hoping that this is going to help the overall finished product of the dress. Now, this is a princess seam dress, so the lining is actually going to help us. I'm going to be using this kind of like a mock-up. So before I even cut into the other one that's just resting, I'm going to cut the dress bodice pieces out of this. I'm going to iron it first and cut them out of this cotton broadcloth. I'm going to give myself maybe a little bit bigger seam allowance than is designated, just so I can then put that on my dress form and make sure everything is going to line up right. Then once I know that this is going to fit and that the pattern is fine, then I'm going to use this as a guide for cutting out my fashion fabric. So it'll be a mock-up, it'll be a pattern, and it'll be the lining. So, stuff can do two things. So I'm going to go ahead and iron this, and we'll get started cutting. Okay, so this is my back, side front, and front. So the first thing I'm going to do is come down and mark all my notches, a couple dots. The notches are the important thing, because with princess seams, you really have to be able to find those to know exactly where the ease needs to go. So what I'm going to do is sew all of these side seams together with a really long basting type of a stitch, just so that when I put it up, it's going to hold together, but I can pull it apart then fairly easily. Alright, so I have all of the pieces sewn together here. I'm just going to give you a quick look. I'm not finishing any edges. I'm not pressing any seams. And I just have it basted actually with a contrasting thread so that I can see it easily. And what I'm going to do is go put this on my dress form, and I'm going to put it inside out so the seam allowances are on the outside of the dress. Alright, so I want to show you just as the pattern has, I have pinned it onto my dress form. Now I have, added a bra on here to make her match closer to my actual size, and she is pretty close to my size, so I feel comfortable matching this dress on here instead of pinning it on myself. So here is where we are. You can see from the side, I think the back is fitting well. The side is going straight down. You want to make sure the side isn't pulling one way or the other. and it's going straight down. Now, this is typical in these types of patterns that in a princess seam, you can get it fitted up here, but in general, they don't have it contoured or fitted underneath the bust. And so I'm actually going to bring this in a little bit. So step by step, how I'm going to do this is I pin the center front to my dress form, so I know that it's not going to get shifted. The same thing with the side seams. I'm pinning the side seam to the dress form, so it's not going to tweak. And that way, as I pinch this in, I know that the center front and the side are staying where they're supposed to be, and I can get a much better fitting. Okay, so I have taken my center front anchoring pin off and my side anchoring pins off, and I want to show you how I have this done. On both sides, and I tried to make them pretty symmetrical, just below the bust, I started tapering it in at the natural waistline. It's at its furthest, and this is at 1 inch here. And then I taper it back out gradually, so when I get to where the fullest part of the hip is, that's where we're blending it back out. So here is the hip is like right here. So from my waistline, I start to gradually take it back out again. Okay, so my next step is I'm taking my heat erasable pen, and I'm just going to kind of on both sides of this draw a little line, little marks along that pin line. Okay, I'm going to do this on both sides of each seam that we're taking in. Okay, so we are looking straight down. This is my front part, this is my center front, and this front part here. Now, what I'm going to need to do is adjust this. But first, what I'm going to do is pull this side seam off and on both sides and just set this side and back portion away. I don't need to do anything with this. The pattern as it was printed is fine for this. So all I'm going to need to do for the back part is just serge edges and come back with a regular size stitch to reinforce this. So that's good. So get my handy dandy seam ripper, go to work pulling the side seam off. Okay, so now I have these two pieces, and I'm going to go ahead and pull these pins out. I wanted to do this while it was flat on the table so I could kind of compare the lines to make sure that they were as symmetrical as I thought they were when I was pinning it. So once I have these pins out, I'm going to draw this line again just to make sure it's nice and smooth on both sides. Okay, so now that I have these two lines drawn, I need to take this seam apart right here. So I end up with my two side fronts and my two front pieces again. Okay, so I have my side fronts on top of each other, my fronts on top of each other. I've got this seam pulled out. And what I'm going to be doing now is this process is so long, this is the way I do it, is once again, I am going to put pins, not as tight as before, but a pin across my line of my top piece. I've got 2 layers here. So let me just put a few more just to hold it in place and mark exactly where that line is from this side. Okay, so this is pinned. What I'm going to do now, move these guys, flip it over, and I want to see how close it is to being the same on the other side. Okay, looks like I'm about 1/8 of an inch to the inside here and here, but to the outside here. So what I'm going to do is take a different color of pen and split the difference. So wherever it is, I kind of come halfway between where the pin is and where the line is on this side, which gives me an average. My body is fairly symmetrical, and this is that's my bottom notch. So you don't want any of this to be above that notch, because this is where you're easing all of this in. So you want to make sure that where you're coming in is below that notch. So I'm going to adjust it so I'm coming in about 1/4 inch below it. So with my marks here, like splitting the difference each way, I'm then going to redraw using still another heat erasing pen. And this line, this new line I'm drawing is going to be the new sewing line, not the cutting line, okay? So we're not going to cut it here. That's our stitching line. That's where it's going to go like this. So what you need to do is draw a cutting line, which would be 5/8 inch from that edge. So I'm going to go back to my first color pen and make some marks at 5/8 from that point. You get the idea. So from this point, I'm going to have a new cutting line, all right? So this cutting line here, I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. Make sure I don't cut that bottom piece because that would be bad. So I'm going to ease it in like this. And now I have a new pattern for my front. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do this same system for the center front piece here. Just even that out. And then we're going to use these pieces when we're cutting out our fashion fabric. So the last thing before you start cutting out the other fabric is, if this is just a one-time shot, you're making one dress for somebody and you're never going to have to do it again, just use this to cut it out. If you are making it for yourself and you think you might use this pattern again, it'd be a very good idea to go ahead and transfer this adjustment onto your pattern paper. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just laying it on here, making sure my notch on my fabric matches up with the notch on the paper. And that way I can just come in and redraw where my new cutting line is. Okay. And then I'll come back in, trim that cutting line, and I'm ready to have my customized paper pattern ready to use. Okay, so all of that just so we could start cutting things out. But what I'm going to do is go ahead and put this version of it together first. So I'm going to go ahead and re-sew all of these panels together with my regular sewing stitch, which, you know, it's about half or less than what a basting stitch is. Then I'm going to, let me show you on this one. Because I have these sewn together already and it is the lining, so this part of it's not going to be seen, I will go ahead and just serge over the edge of both of these together. So instead of doing one piece then the other, I'll just serge over both. And put the whole thing together, put it back on my dress form for a final fitting just to make sure that it works. So here is the lining, and honestly, if you are using a weight of fabric that you think doesn't need to be lined, like that lightweight canvas that I used for that other dress, or maybe like a light denim or something, you don't have to line it. You could do all of that fitting stuff and then make this your dress. I need to line mine because the fabric that I'm going to be using just has no shape or structure to it with all this stuff going on. I need to make sure it does. In general, I press my seams allowances towards the back. So like the sides are towards the back, the front are towards, so everything wraps around to the back. That's how I usually do it. And so I think it's going to be okay. Right now I have these two just fold it to the center front. There's more room in there because there's going to be some overlap for the buttons, but I just wanted to see if I have it folded to center front, am I going to be able to match it up? All right, so with all of that behind us, I'm finally ready to cut out my pattern or cut out my fabric. So remember, we do have this border print. Right now I'm questioning all of my motives in life, but we've come this far, so here we go. You see these stripes? I am going to, because this is the selvage and on the other side is the selvage, my straight of grain technically runs this way. I am breaking all of the rules that are there right now by laying my fabric pieces or my pattern pieces this way. So I am going to be using these lines, these stripes on here, as my imaginary straight of grain. All right, well, I can tell right now that I am going to have to cut these pieces out individually, one at a time. And this fabric is just, it's difficult. It's being difficult, but that's okay. We can make it work. So what I've done is, here's my straight line, okay? And looking very carefully, I can see where that stripe is underneath. So I have pinned in various places along my straight line that same stripe. So I know this piece is going up and down. You don't need to watch me do this. Just understand I am cutting out each piece at a time. So I'll be cutting this side of this side front piece, and then I will flip it upside down and find a place for the back side of it. And I'm going to worry about my main dress part first. All right, I got the dress cut out of this fabric. And we're very early on to this project, but I can tell you right now, this stuff is driving me nuts. It will not stay still. It wants to shift everywhere. Yeah, this is going to drive me nuts, but I had enough. I got it all cut out, and I'm ready to get started putting the dress together. So the game plan is going to put together the fashion fabric part similar to the way that we did the lining, except I'm putting pockets in this one. So no pockets in the lining, only pockets in this. And once I have those two together, I'm going to match them up wrong side to wrong side. So the right sides of each are on the outside, and baste those together around up the side, across the top, and down the side, leaving the whole bottom open. After that, I'll be able to put the facing around there and flip it. And of course, sleeves. We're going to need sleeves in there too. But that's the general game plan. I am done dealing with this for today. So I'm going to call it a day. And tomorrow we'll start sewing on it. But let me give you another close-up of this fabric. You see that? You see that with its real stretchiness? It's like a crinkle rayon or something like that. It's beautiful, but it's a pain to work on. So if you see it in the store, be warned. All right, see you tomorrow. Good morning. So I had to take care of a lot of things this morning, but now I think I should be good to go on sewing the rest of the day. So I was thinking a lot about this fabric last night, and I tried a few things. Well, let me show you what I got. Okay, so this, let me just show you this part up here. It does not want to stay still. It does not want to stay straight. It has, because it is a crinkle fabric, if I was to iron it, it would stretch out. I don't want to iron it because I want to be able to just throw this dress in the washer and dryer, pull it out without ironing it. So I want to leave that crinkle in there. So I have to make sure when I'm sewing that I do not stretch this out. Because another thing is, because I have the lining already done, if I stretch this out when sewing, it's not going to match up with the lining. So I tried a couple things this morning. First, on my scrap here, I just folded it in half and did a seam, just to see what a regular seam on this fabric would do. And I was able to sew and keep the crinkles in, but it's kind of loose. And when I open it, I think it would work. I think it would be okay. It would be fine. but it's not my favorite, okay? I see little puckers, not really puckers, but bumps. And again, I don't really want to iron it. I can carefully press with the iron straight down so that I keep the wrinkles in there and just make them flat, okay? And that would probably work, but I'm going to make this a little more complicated. On this side of my tester piece, I ironed a very, very lightweight fusible interfacing. There's the label. So it just says basics for apparel, so whatever it is. But anyway, okay, so I ironed that on here, just pressing it, not ironing like this, but just pressing it down. So I was able to fuse the interfacing to the fabric and keep all those little ridges in there. And then I made a seam on this one, and I really like the way this seam looks. It looks nice, it looks sturdy, it looks pulled together, but I still have the look of this. So here's my plan. I am going to put this very lightweight fusible interfacing on the upper part of my pieces. So like, okay, so say this is my pattern, probably from about this point, from about hip level up, in this bodice area only of those long strips, I'm going to put the fusible interfacing. The bottom part here, I want to make sure it stays really flowy, so I'm not. But up here where it needs to be more structured, you know, around the bust, around the waist, around all of this, and this facing here with the buttonholes and everything, that's going to have facing on it, and that's going to have interfacing there, so that part's fine. So that's my plan. So the first thing I'm going to do this morning is cut out the pattern pieces in the interfacing for this part here. I have my back piece cut out of my interfacing. I'm going to show you what I'm going to do on this back piece, and then off camera I will do it for all of the other pieces also. So first thing is I just used the width of the interfacing, and I'm just using that as an approximate guide. You know, it doesn't matter to me if the very bottoms of the interfacing line up exactly across the bottom, because this is so lightweight it shouldn't affect it. Alright, so you can kind of see this blue fabric does not want to behave, so I'm going to do my best to kind of get it lined up first, but ultimately I'm going to use this piece of interfacing as the guide of how to line up this fabric, because I am assuming that the interfacing is much more true to pattern size than the fabric is. Okay, I think we're close enough. So I've got my iron, and I'm not pressing down hard. I'm basically just setting the iron down. And I'm trying to be very careful not to move it, not to do this kind of thing with it, because I don't want to flatten out those ridges. This type of technique would work good if you have any kind of very lightweight fabric that you want a little more structured, like maybe you're doing a jacket or something and you just need to reinforce it. Now in your pattern directions, the first thing it's going to want you to do is stay stitch here. Since I am interfacing, that's not as critical for me. But if you are not interfacing yours, make sure you reinforce all the curves in princess seams. Either stay stitching or, you know, my favorite, stay tape, woven stay tape. But just make sure all of the curves are reinforced. I didn't stress about that too much on my lining because it's a very durable broadcloth type thing, but anything, especially something that's as movable as this, make sure that you do that. So again, the directions say to, but because I have fusible interfacing the whole way down this edge, I'm not going to worry about that. I am assuming that this fusible interfacing is going to hold that curve nice and secure for me. So I want to show you how I'm going to be stitching these. First, I'm just going to again, assuming that side is reinforced, I'm going to pin up my center back. So normally I would run my serger around each piece before I sew it. To me, on this dress, it is more important to get my stitching line in and secure before I serge. I want to just make sure there's no chance of anything shifting because of the fabric, because of the design style and things like that. So for this pattern, I will be stitching first. I'm starting up at my top. And I'm going to go all the way down, and then I will serge it after that. And when I get down to this part, I'm going to try to be very careful not to stretch it, just to try to leave it nice and easy and guide it from both sides. Take it easy and guide it through from both sides. If you had a walking foot on your machine, this would be a good time to use your walking foot. Unfortunately, my walking foot for this machine is not working right now. I need to get myself a new one. So this will be fine too. Just guiding it through on both sides of the presser foot can work wonders for using a difficult fabric. Okay, so now that I have this seam done, okay, so this is what it looks like in the bottom part. Yes, I have two different threads. I'm running out of thread. Okay, so here's the thing where I live. I live in the middle of nowhere, and the only stores nearby, like within an hour's drive, are Amish stores. And they are closed on Thursdays, and today is a Thursday, because Thursday is wedding day. So if there's a wedding, it's scheduled on a Thursday. And because of that, every Amish store is always closed on Thursday around here. So no thread till tomorrow. But anyway, I digress. This is it, my seam on the top. Okay. And I am going to go ahead and serge down this edge. Okay, so I've run it through the serger, so now this is what my seam looks like. And I am very happy with this. I think that having that really light interfacing is going to really help with the construction. So with this also, it helps me to be able to make sure that, like, I have stripes on this fabric, and to make sure that my stripes are going the right direction, that nothing is going wonky. So I think that that's a really good thing. And you can see the fabric is still soft, but it's not unmanageable. So I wanted to show you, I've done my center back. I've sewed it to the sides. I have not done the actual side seams yet because there's a pocket that I'm going to need to put in. But I'm going to do the front to the side front first. But I've just pinned this over my lining, and I just wanted to let you see how it's looking so far. This is my side front, and this is my center front. And I want to show you, I have marked all of my markings actually with my heat erasable pen, because again, one of my main purposes right now is to make sure that this very swooshy fabric does not get damaged or stretched out of shape. So I've got dots for pocket, but what I wanted to focus on here are these two notches. Up at the bust, this is the most tricky of the notches to match up. So you're going to have one above the fullness and one below the fullness, and the same here. So when you overlay them, so let's say I'm matching my bottom notch, you see it's very different. What I would suggest is putting the fuller one on the bottom near the feed dogs of your machine, and work this in just like I work in the sleeve cap of sleeves, where you hold the top very tight, pull this bottom one out so it's level, and let the feed dogs work in any fullness. So I am coming up to where that bottom notch is, just going around the waistline right now. Now, this pin is where that bottom notch is. sewing at about a 5/8 allowance. So I'm going to get up here. All right. So at this point, I have a pin in the middle, and I have that pin just to hold the two edges level. So underneath it's a little bunchy, but this pin I'm just kind of letting stay there because it's going to help me guide it. So I pull it a little bit tighter and pull it back a little bit so it's running a little slower so the feed dogs have time to work in any extra fullness. Pull that pin out, make sure that the edges are still level. And do the same thing where I pull the top just to make sure the feed dogs can work in the fullness. Okay. And then sew like normal. So let's see what it looks like on the other side. So again, here is my notches, so that's where it is, and if I pull it out, you can see there are no puckers, there are no wrinkles, because those feed dogs take their time and they just work it in very incrementally. So I think that's a nice curve, and I'm happy with that. And again, this is a handy place to use a pressing ham if you have one when you're pressing that bust seam, just because you're able to curve it around. So I'm just rocking my iron instead of moving it back and forth. And having that curve there will help retain that shape. So the next thing I'm going to work on is the pockets. I have 2 sets of pockets, 2 pieces for each. And I am going to go ahead and serge around the edges of these 4 pieces first, because I'm going to be putting them on one at a time, and that way I can make sure that everything is going to be finished off well. Okay, so I just want to show you something of kind of giving you why I put together the dress the way I did. These I just serged around the edges like I normally would for a woven, and then press them down like I normally would, and you can see I've got all kinds of different shapes going on. Now, these pockets are going to be on the inside of the dress. They're not going to be visible, so it doesn't really bother me. I can kind of reform it and make it work. The main thing is I needed to make sure I had the edges finished off. Now I'm looking on the directions and I do not see an instruction to understitch, but I definitely will be doing that. So what that means is for this pocket, here's my seam, it's all sewed in. The seam allowance is pressed towards the pocket, and I'm just kind of guiding it there because I'm not ironing this yet. I'm not serging the edge of this because I'm going to wait until after it is sewn onto the back piece, just to let you know. But I'm going to come back on this side of the seam, on the pocket side of the seam, and run a line of stitching about 1/8 of an inch in. All the way down, so that way when you turn it, the seam's going to curve in really nice. And we want to make sure, especially in a very sleek princess seamed dress, that everything folds and lays as perfectly flat as we can. And just to let you know, there are no dots on the pattern, but they do have a notch marked. So when you're going to mark your pieces, make sure you mark that notch, because that's really the only thing that's going to help you line up your pocket piece since the dots aren't there. Alright, so I have my 2 side seams pinned together. My front is on the top, my bottom is on the bottom, my back is on the bottom. And I want to show you how I'm going to stitch it first from the very top coming down, and you're going to stitch add a 5/8 allowance, which is inside all this stitching, and come down to the first dot. Okay, back up to that, and I'll probably double stitch that. So right here you can see all of this stitching is on the dress side of all of the stitching we did for the pocket and the understitching. Okay, then at the 5/8 mark here. Okay, so I'm just going to draw it on here because that's easier for when I'm sewing. You just start going around the pocket. I'm going to go all the way around the outside of the pocket, come back over here to the far side of all of this stitching for the pocket. So here's my 3/8 inch seam, my understitching. I'm going to go past that about 1/8 of an inch. Then I'm going to come up here, lock it in place at this dot here, and go straight down all the way down. And what that's going to do is, by keeping my stitching line going from top to bottom and top to bottom, it's going to make it more continuity so that you'll be less likely to have a pucker right here. So that's how I'm going to do it. And then after I get the side seam done, I'm going to come back and I'll be serging just this little top section here and this section here. This part in here, this one little bit, will not be serged, but I am not worried about that. I do have interfacing and I do have a double row of stitching, so that's not going to fray on me. Besides, it will be inside, protected between this layer and the lining layer, so that's not going to bother me one bit. Alright, so I want to show you what my side seam looks like. I'm just kind of hovering with some steam here. Now, one thing, since I'm breaking a bunch of sewing rules anyway, I just decided to break one more. And I am pressing my side seam allowance towards the front. So the reason I'm doing that is because, one, the pocket that is sewn at that place needs to go towards the front, obviously, because that's where you put your hand in. You don't put your hand in going backwards. But I don't want to cut into the seam allowance. Like, here's my pocket, okay? I don't want to cut right here to push this part of the seam allowance back because I have it finished together, and I think that that might make it a little more unstable, and at that point I might end up with a little bit of a dent right here if that point goes too far. So just to be on the safe side, you know, looking at all my options, I think pressing the seam allowance to the front is the best option. But I think it's coming along well. So you can see the pocket right here is doing really well. The opening is here to here. Okay, the pocket itself is this big. So it's a good sized pocket. The seam is laying nice and flat. Because we did the understitching, here's what we have. We have a little gap here where there's just a natural space because we have a 5/8 inch seam allowance up here. Okay, and this is at 3/8. But it's going to help curve everything in so we don't see any of this stuff from the outside. So I think it's going to work out well. I'm going to do the other side and catch up with you. Okay, so I just want to give you a quick update. This is the outside dress, and my lining is in the inside here. Now, if you're not lining your dress, you can skip this step altogether, of course. But since I am, what I need to do at this point is hem up my lining. And I like my lining to be a little bit shorter than my dress. And you can see my dress has strange angles going on down here. I'm going to need this to rest overnight just to even itself out. But this I need to go ahead and hem. And I'm going to be putting about a 2-inch hem into this. So I hope you can see this is the bottom edge of my lining, that there is a lot of curve here that you're going to need to work in. Now, the method that I'm going to use to hem this skirt, you can use to hem your finished product dress if you want, or honestly any other dress that has a curved edge. So the first thing I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be sewing a seam at 1/4 inch. So that to me puts the edge of the fabric right along the edge side of my presser foot. As I sew it, I'm going to be creating, like I do when I do make a sleeve cap, I'm going to be creating a slight gathering. So I push my finger behind the presser foot down and close to it, and then let it go. And what that does is creates, well here, let me do a little bit more so I can get it closer to the camera. Okay. So can you see what it does is it makes a very slight little puckered accordion type of seam there. Now make sure when you're going around the seam allowances are still laying in the direction that you want them to. Okay, so we're over here at the ironing board. You can see I have my little puckery stitches here, and I'm going to show you how I work this. I'm folding it over at that seam line so the seam is just barely on the inside of my fold. And then I'm going to mark up, I'm going to do 1.5 inches and pin that. I'm going to do that in the middle. So first folding it at my stitching line and then marking it or pinning it here. So you can see that those gathers kind of worked that curve in so that I can have a nice stitching line up here. So I'm just going to tuck these under, let them sit there. Tuck these over here under, let them sit there. Okay, just kind of press it in, make sure everybody is happy where they are, and then I can come back and carefully iron it. And I just kind of press it straight down because what you want is you want those puckers to stay there. You don't want to work them out, but you want them to be able to adjust themselves so you have, you know, a fairly smoothed edge at the top. Okay, so all of a sudden I have all of that extra ease worked in. I'm just going to pin this here. Okay, you can see how it's just gonna work itself in. So now of course you could sew it with a straight stitch. You could sew it by hand. You could sew it any way you want. I'm just going to show you the way I'm choosing to hem this right now. And what I have is I have my zigzag stitch set. It's at a number 2, so it's fairly narrow. And I have my stitch length set for a basting stitch, which is a 4. And I'm pretty much sewing this as if you had a blind hem stitch on your sewing machine. So this is my, see if you can see, this is my hem here that we just folded up. You fold it over so the hem is on the bottom, and what you see on the top is just about 1/8 of an inch of that pressed over hem part sticking out next to the folded over part of the dress. And I run it so that my stitching is not right at the center, but it's just a little bit onto the hem side of center, just a little bit. And then I just run it down. And what that's going to do is just give me a nice even, like pinprick looking stitch. Now, let's see here if I can pull one of these over here to show you. So then when I open it up from the outside, see if you can see here, you know, there's just some little pricks right here is what you're going to see. And unfortunately my thread doesn't match this exactly, but if it did, once you press it, it would be pretty close to invisible. Okay, so this, out of the way, this is my inside lining, and I'm going to be, at this point, combining my lining with my dress. What would I call this? My right side, my fashion. Anyway, I'm going to be combining these two. So what I'm doing is I'm putting the wrong sides of these two together, and I'm going to be pinning it across the top all the way and down the front center sides. Okay, so like just matching everything up so it's going to basically create a single piece. After this point, we're going to be treating this whole section as a single piece. So then we can just follow the instructions normally. So just like this, I'm going to pin it all the way around and then come back, and I am just going to basting stitch it, probably at about 3/8 of an inch, still all the way around. So I'm leaving the bottom open. So I have it basted, and I'm just showing you what it looks like once the two layers are joined together. Starting on the sleeve now, I am doing the longer sleeved version. And so, because it's this fabric, I am not serging around it until after I have it stitched. The first thing it wants you to do is there are 2 circles, right there and right there. So I have transferred those markings onto my fabric. Well, here it is. And so what I need to do is it wants you to stay stitched to reinforce those. I am going to be fusing a piece of stabilizing stuff. It's actually a woven. All right, so I have fused a piece of woven stay tape here, a wide one in the corner, to stabilize that dot point. Now the next thing I'm going to be doing is pinning and stitching together the side seams here. And so similar to the dress, what I'm going to do is after I stitch it, then I will come back and serge that edge. And at the same time I do that, I will also be serging this bottom edge to make it nice and clean and ready to hem. All right, so I have this center seam sewn. I have it serged. And just to tidy things up, I have serged around the cuff. Okay. Now up here, I have marked where the dots are. This little clip is just to remind me which side is the back. So what I need to do right now is clip to those circles. I'm not going all the way, but I'm coming like within 1/8 of an inch of the circle. I'm gonna do it on this side. Then you need to get some bias tape. I don't have exactly the right color. I have this darker royalish navy blue, and I think that's going to be fine for what we're using it for. So it's a flat fold, single fold bias tape, okay? And you're going to open up one side and sew it along here. So this is going to go along the top of your sleeves. Okay, so it wants you to sew it so that this crease of your bias tape here is at your 5/8 inch seam line. So what I'm going to be doing is basically when I open it up, just eyeball about 1/4 inch above, okay, and pin it there. And that's going to put the space between the crease of the bias tape and the edge about 5/8 of an inch. So going ahead, pinning it around, and then coming back and stitching in that crease a straight stitch. Okay, so at this point, the top of our sleeve has the bias tape sewn to it. And what I need to do now is come back and trim this seam allowance down so that it's about even with the top of the bias tape here. So I'm just cutting it about in half, which is going to give me about 1/4 inch seam allowance. So doing that all the way around. Once done with that, going to turn your tape so it's all on the inside. So here it is, it's on the inside. And see how I have it where I sewed, I have just a little bit of the fashion fabric rolling over. I'm doing that on purpose so that my bias tape isn't going to stick out too much because the bias tape is obviously a different color. So I'm going to come back and we're going to top stitch along here. It's okay if it shows because this is going to be a casing, so it is going to be bunched up. All right, so this is the casing now that we've made at the top of the sleeve with the bias tape. It's lovely. And this is the point in today's episode where Marie realizes that she forgot to buy 1/2-inch elastic. And that is what they call for to go through this. Honestly, this casing is a lot wider than 1/2-inch, but so what I did is I sewed 2 pieces of 1/4-inch together to make a 1/2-inch. And I think that's going to give me enough stretch, and it's going to be hidden in here, so who's going to know? So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and using my bodkin, slide the elastic through. When you get it done, you're going to stitch at this edge to secure it and at this edge to secure it. Okay, so for doing the bottom edge, it only calls for a turned up hem type of a casing because we're using a 1/4-inch elastic through here. So the first thing I'm going to do is take a tiny piece of stitch witchery, slip it underneath this seam allowance, and press that down. What that's going to do is basically glue that seam allowance to the fabric. You could stitch it down, obviously. You could sew down your seam allowance, but this will work just fine. So here, now there's no way that bodkin's going to get hung up on that little piece there. So I'm going to go ahead and turn up my edge, probably about 3/4 of an inch, and then once I have that pressed, I'll just tuck in my little edge so it looks nice and clean. And then I'll stitch straight around there, leaving an opening probably right over here so I can slip that elastic through. At this point, we're ready to attach the sleeve to the dress. So with right side of sleeve together with the right side of the dress, I have this pinned on. Actually, this side, I went ahead and basted just so I could make sure it would hold still when I was sewing it. Now there's these little corners on the dress, and that's where that dot, where's my camera here? That's where that dot that we slashed to, where it was reinforced, that's where that comes into play. So that dot is diagonal from the point so that you can spread the elastic part over to go along one edge while the rest of the sleeve is over on the other edge. Okay, so the next thing we have to take care of is the facing. And so I need to cut in interfacing pieces of these front facing and back facing. And I'm going to use, which is a slightly firmer interfacing than the stuff that I used to line the bodice with. And I think that it'll give enough body that it'll be nice and firm for all the buttons and buttonholes that are going to be put through here. So I'm going to go ahead and cut. The back one is cutting 1 on the fold, and then of course 2 of the front one. And I'm going to go ahead and fuse that on, and I'll be right back. So I've got the interfacing fused to the sleeves, fused to the facing pieces, and I'm going to go ahead and sew the backs to the fronts and then pin it on here. But before I pin it, after I've sewn this, I'm going to come back and nicely finish the edge of the facing. Okay, so this is my back, my center back. These are my casings for my sleeves, and I'm going to start pinning my facing here. So you can see the facing goes over all of this sleeve stuff and everything like that. So I'm just going to start here and work my way all the way around. Okay, so I have the facing sewn on. I did just serge around the edges here. And before I press it and before I understitch it, I'm going to be grading these seams because there's a lot of bulk here, and I want to make sure that it lays as flat as possible. And also on the front seam where the buttons and buttonhole is going to go, I want to grade that so that it's going to be easy to make those buttonholes. So the way that I'm going to do this is do it in a few different layers. The one that is the facing layer that has the stiffer interfacing here, I'm going to be taking this down probably to a fat 1/8 of an inch. And then the elastic that's poking through there, I'm just going to cut that off level. Then we have, well, because I have it lined, I have 2 more layers. Now, if you don't have lining, you'll only have 1. In that case, I'm going to take these 2 layers up to about 3/8 of an inch, or a fat 1/4 inch. So it's going to be more like that. Then when you get to your corners, make sure that you're going to be cutting around, taking off any bulk. The corners themselves, like right here, there's a turn. Okay, I want to make sure that I have all of this stiffer interfacing out of the way there. And this is all that reinforcement and everything. So that's the goal, taking the bulk out of the corners and then grading the rest with a staggered thickness. All right, so now that the seam allowances are graded so that everything is staggered here, I'm going to fold the facing out, and the seam allowances will be under the facing, not under the fabric up here. We're going to understitch the facing. So you're just going to do it right side up so you can see this side, but feel it as you go to make sure the seam allowance is staying the right way. And what you're going to do to understitch it is just basically run a row of straight stitches, about 1/8 of an inch in on the facing side. Okay, and just flatten it out as you go and stitch it all around there. Now when you get up towards the corners, you're not going to be able to stitch all the way to the corner. Just get as far as you can and then start on the next part. Okay, sure, get off. Good morning. All right, so today is the day I think that we're going to finish this dress. And this morning I took it off the dress form, just put it on over my jammies just to figure out where my button placement should be. And I realized that this elastic is way too long. With a princess seam, especially one that's going to be fitted like this dress is, the bodice is naturally going to want to stay in place. So the sleeves need to be the right size for your shoulders, otherwise they'll just fall off, which is what mine did. I'm not going to be cutting into any of this stuff because that's just too much of a headache to open up, but I am at the casing, or here. So up here in a middle section, I'm just going to open up some of these stitches, pull out the elastic, take in a few inches, and then sew it back together, slip it in, and slip close. Okay, now with that fixed, we're ready to keep going on with our directions. So way up here on the top of page 5, we've done the understitching, all right? And now we need to tack down the facing. Now, on their instructions, they show you to tack it down to the seam allowances. On mine, because I aligned it, I don't have seam allowances visible. So what I'm going to do is just tack it at the seams where I would have allowances, which means I'm going to put some stitches, just hand stitches, and just so it doesn't go through to the final outer fabric. Okay, so I've got all of these tacked down, and now it's time to put on some buttonholes. So you can look on your drawing here in the directions to see which side the buttonhole should be on. And honestly, I always have to do that because I forget. On your buttonhole guide, you can see that line is where they want you to sew the buttons. But the buttonholes actually start about 1/4 inch in from the edge. So for the side that I am going to be placing my buttonholes on, I'm going to draw this line at looks like a fat 1/4 inch all the way down the edge. Okay, so I have this line drawn where my buttonhole is going to start. Now I have folded my buttonhole guide at the line that was printed on here where the buttons are sewn on, so that now I can come back and I just have it sitting on top of here with some weights. I don't want to pin it because that might change how it lays and everything, so I just have it sitting on here with some weights, I'm come back with my marking pen and draw a little cross hatch on those lines where the buttonholes are going to go. So now I know I need 9 buttons. I didn't want to figure that out ahead of time because I'm just going to be finding something from my supply, and I have plenty of buttons in the house. But I'm not going to mark the end of my buttonhole until I know for sure which buttons I'm going to use. So give me a few minutes. I'm going to hunt through all of this stuff and I'll come up with 9 buttons and I'll be right back. Well, I decided I'm just going to use white. These are actually some vintage buttons. They are larger than a shirt button. Probably, what does this say? You know, about 5/8 of an inch size button. And I think that's going to be fine because I have white flowers on here and everything, so that's going to be good. So now I need to go to my favorite buttonhole trick, which is my buttonholer that I use on my treadle machine. Okay, so I'm over here at my treadle machine because this is where we put on buttonholes, and I have set it up to work with this size buttonholes. Hopefully there is a short video called using a rotary buttonhole attachment so that you can get all the details on how this works, because I'm not going to go too much into that right now because you might not have one to need. So anyway, I have my little marks on here. This is how I have my buttonholes marked. I have this line here, which is where I'm going to start my buttonhole, and this line is the track that my buttonhole should follow. Okay, so I'm starting up at the very top one, and I'm going to get this placed. Now, the reason that we spent so much time grading the seam line, especially down this front, was so that when you make your buttonholes, everything's going to line up really well. Because if there was a big step down here, the buttonhole placement is so close to that edge that it would be very difficult to run a nice smooth buttonhole. Just going to snip off my tail, keep going. Alrighty, so now it's time to get all of our buttons placed on the opposite side. Now, I saw this in one of those sewing hack things that pops up, and I've been wanting to try it. If it works, fabulous. If not, I'll just delete this part. So, here we go. So you're supposed to get Scotch tape, put it down. I have my buttons just placed over where my buttonholes are, and I'm putting my Scotch tape centered on my buttons and taping it down. Very lightly with a Sharpie, marking where my fabric ends down there. Now, what the hack said is you should be able to lift up your tape and your buttons will stay with it. So far, so good. Let me lay these over here. Okay, I just did a little cheat thing and put a mark where the very top button should be lining up with. So let's see if that helps me. If this works, that would be so fun. Alright, so now I have it taped down on this side. Let's see. If I line up this piece, well, looky there. It did work. Fabulous. Okay. So I got my buttons all placed. But you know what? I'm going to make sure they are in far enough because the in placement should be 3/8. And it looks like I was getting gradually closer at the bottom, so I'm just going to reposition that real quick. So just really quick, this is how I hand sew on a button. I use a very strong thread. This is an ancient one, but it works. It's what I'm using. And I double it, and I put both tails through the eye of my needle. Use a needle threader. It'll save your life. Anyway, I don't tie a knot. What I do is I'm going to go up through a hole, and I'm sewing it through this tape. I'll just clip the tape off when I'm done. Whoops. All right, forget I did that. Got a little carried away. Starting over. So I go up through a hole. Don't pull it all the way through. Okay. Go down through the next hole. And on the back side, there's the big loop. And I slip my needle through that loop. Sorry, I got a lot of twisties here. I slip my needle through that loop and pull it, and that's going to anchor it down. So now I'm sewing with 2 strands of very, very strong thread. So I don't have to make a whole lot of swipes. I'm probably going to make about 2 swipes in each eye. So there's 2. Okay. My telephone keeps ringing. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to peel off this tape of the one that I just sewed. Looks like it just comes right off of there. And just move it out of the way there. Then before I do my last stitch, I'm going to stick it up, but don't bring it through the eye of the needle. It's just right underneath it. And I take 3 swipes around it, kind of making a thread shank, and then I push my needle straight through all those threads underneath it and pull. And that's going to just anchor that shank in, tighten everything up, and I'm ready to go to the next one. Alrighty, got all the buttons sewed on over here, and it is time to cut open the buttonholes. So I've used a chisel before in my videos, and I also have buttonhole scissors, so this is what I'm going to use right now. And you use them, you start, it has this gap that you can put the space that is not to be cut in, and just put the bladey part, see if you can see, right into the buttonhole. Now I put a straight pin at the edge just to make sure I don't get excited and clip too far. So I go right up to it and then come back in. After I cut my buttonhole, I like to stick my fingernail in and rub it just to make sure if there's going to be one of those lengthwise threads that's going to be in there that's going to drive you crazy because it feels like it wants to stop you, that you can clip anything like that off first. So we're at the final stage of this project, the hem, and let me just spin her around so you can see. We got all different length kind of things going on here. Because this fabric wants to stretch this way. And so this is what I'm going to do. I've got this hem marker, and I have it adjusted to the point where it's the shortest, which is right about here. So I'm going to mark it. What you do is you just squeeze the thing together, and it makes a slot you can just put a straight pin through. Okay, so I am going to mark this all the way around and cut it along this line so that at least I have a level place to start with. Alright, so getting ready for the hem, I've trimmed the bottom, and you fold the bottom of your facing. This is the front facing coming down here. You fold it outside, and I've drawn a line where I'm going to be stitching. And so I'm going to sew it straight across both facings. I'm having about, oh, you can see that's a little lower. I'm going to be sewing it at about 1/2 inch. And then when I turn that, that'll give me some nice corners at the bottom of my front opening. And that will also give me guide to start with to do my little rolled hem. And I'm just going to do a very nice little rolled hem, just pressing it with my fingers, not with the iron, and get it all pinned in. So I've got the bottom of my facing stitched across. I'm going to clip the corner and also make sure that I have any extra bulk taken out right here, just so that it's going to lie nice. Okay, now I should be able to flip this corner right side out. So this is what it's going to be from the outside. You can just see it's going to be just a nice clean corner here. And on the inside, it's going to give me a guide to start, and I'm going to just go ahead and roll and pin a nice narrow hem all the way around. This fabric is just so crazy. I'm going to try to be very careful not to stretch it and to make it as even as possible. But no guarantees at this point, so we'll just see how it turns out. So the dress is done finally, and there's a lot of different things that went into this dress, starting with fitting a princess seamed pattern to your particular body size, your particular body shape, really. One hint is when you cut out a princess seam and you're like maybe halfway between two sizes, pick the bigger size to cut out because it's a lot better and easier to take in than to let out. When you're making a outfit like this where you're planning to use your mock-up as your lining. But with that, another thing is that the way that I hemmed the lining would be an excellent way to hem the dress in general. I just couldn't do that because the fabric, this crazy fabric that I chose for some reason, would not lend itself to that. But using that gathering technique as you stitch a hem is fabulous. The other thing is pay attention to your shoulder straps. Make sure that the elastic is actually going to fit you, because the princess seam bodice wants to hug your body. So the sleeves aren't holding up the weight of the whole dress. They're just holding up the sleeve. So they could fall off very easily. Which, if you want a off-the-shoulder peasant blousey kind of look, it might be cute. So there's that. The other thing is, I don't even know what the other thing is. I don't know. In general, I like the pattern. I like the dress. I think it went together pretty well. The only thing is this style might be a little young for me, but I think it's fun. It reminds me of the old gunny sacks type dresses. You know, I mean, without all of the extra lace and ribbon and everything, but that kind of style, which, you know, flashback to the 80s. But I like it. And in general, I hope you liked it too. I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.